After 10 years alone, a black millionaire finally holds a woman. When a single mom crashes into his life, the sound of screeching tires and shattering glass pierced the morning silence as Sophia Chen's battered Honda Civic collided with the wrought iron gates of the most exclusive estate in Beacon Hill, sending her grocery bags flying and her 4-year-old daughter Emma's juice box exploding across the pristine marble entrance like a crime scene painted in apple juice and shattered dreams. Marcus Washington had been standing at his floor-to-ceiling window sipping his morning coffee in the same ritual he'd maintained for 10 years alone, untouched, wrapped in isolation that had become both armor and prison since the day he'd sworn never to let another human being close enough to destroy him again. The crash outside his gates should have been nothing more than an inconvenience requiring his security team's attention, but something about the chaos unfolding on his doorstep would shatter the carefully constructed walls around his heart in ways that luxury and solitude never could. Sophia's day had started at 4:30 a.m. with Emma's fever spiking to 103 degrees, followed by a frantic call to her pediatrician, a rushed trip to the pharmacy for medication she could barely afford. And now this, her car's brake failure on the steep hill leading past mansions where people lived, lives so different from hers, they might as well have been on different planets. As a single mother working double shifts as a night nurse while completing her master's degree in public health, she existed in a perpetual state of calculated survival, where one mechanical failure could trigger a cascade of consequences that would affect everything from rent payments to Emma's childcare arrangements. The stakes couldn't have been higher for either of them, though neither understood it yet. Marcus's decade of emotional exile was about to collide with Sophia's desperate struggle for stability, creating possibilities neither had dared to imagine. What Marcus didn't know, what his security cameras and background checks would never reveal, was that the woman whose accident had breached his fortress of isolation was carrying secrets that would challenge everything he believed about trust, vulnerability, and the price of letting someone see past the protective barriers that wealth and pain had taught him to maintain. The irony would have been devastating if either had understood it in that moment. The man who had everything money could buy but had never learned to receive love was about to meet the woman who had nothing but love to give, whose very presence would force him to choose between the safety of his self-imposed exile and the terrifying possibility that some things were worth risking everything to protect and cherish. If you find value in real stories told with clarity and truth, make sure to subscribe to stay informed with Real Father Story. Blood trickled down Sophia's forehead as she fought her way out of the crumpled driver's seat, her nursing training overriding personal panic as she assessed Emma's condition with hands that trembled despite years of emergency room experience. The 4-year-old was crying, but moving normally, no obvious signs of serious injury, though the trauma of the accident had triggered the kind of sobbing that came from a child's deep understanding that something terrible had almost happened to the only parent she had left in the world. "Mommy's okay, baby," Sophia whispered, her voice steady despite the pain shooting through her ribs and the growing awareness that her already precarious financial situation had just become catastrophic. The Honda's front end was completely destroyed, the steam rising from its engine bay like incense, marking the death of her transportation, her independence, and quite possibly her ability to maintain the delicate balance that kept their small family afloat. Marcus watched from his window as security cameras captured every angle of the scene unfolding at his gates. The young woman in scrubs checking her daughter's pupils for signs of concussion. The methodical way she triaged their situation despite her own obvious injuries. The gentle competence with which she comforted the child while simultaneously calculating damage and options with the kind of efficiency that came from years of managing crises with limited resources and no backup support. His first instinct was familiar. Let security handle it, insurance companies would manage the details, and within hours the inconvenience would be resolved without requiring his personal involvement or emotional investment. 10 years of avoiding human connection had taught him to delegate everything that might create opportunities for people to get close enough to disappoint or betray him. But something about the woman's careful attention to her daughter, the way she shielded the child's view of the destroyed car while maintaining calm authority in the midst of chaos, triggered memories he'd spent a decade trying to forget. The intercom crackled as his security chief requested instructions about how to handle the situation. Standard protocol would involve police reports, insurance adjusters, and towing services that would remove all evidence of the intrusion within hours. Marcus's hand moved toward the button that would set those wheels in motion, but froze as he watched Sophia lift Emma from the car with movements that revealed both physical pain and absolute determination to protect her daughter from further trauma. "Sir," the security chief prompted, waiting for instructions that would restore order to the pristine world Marcus had constructed around his emotional fortress. Instead of responding through the intercom, Marcus found himself moving toward the front door for the first time in months, his bare feet padding across marble floors that had been designed to impress visitors he never invited and entertain guests he never welcomed. The massive oak door felt heavier than usual as he opened it, cool morning air rushing into spaces that had been sealed against the world and all its potential for causing pain. Sophia looked up as the estate's front door opened, expecting to see security personnel or perhaps domestic staff authorized to handle the inconvenience she'd created. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who commanded attention despite his casual attire, tall, dark-skinned, with the kind of presence that spoke of success earned rather than inherited. His fitted black t-shirt and designer jeans looked effortless but expensive, and his confident posture suggested someone accustomed to being in control of every situation. But what struck her most was his eyes, which held a wariness that she recognized from her own mirror during the worst periods of her life. "Are you hurt?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying concern that surprised him with its genuineness. He'd intended to assess the situation quickly and delegate resolution to appropriate professionals, but something about Sophia's combination of competence and vulnerability was drawing him into personal involvement he'd spent years avoiding. "We're okay," Sophia replied automatically, though her left arm was cradled against her ribs in a way that suggested otherwise. "I'm so sorry about your gait. My brakes failed and I couldn't stop in time. I'll take care of all the repairs, I promise." The immediate assumption of financial responsibility revealed both integrity and anxiety about costs she clearly couldn't afford. Marcus's trained eye took in details that told the story of her circumstances: the scrubs that had been worn thin from countless washings, the car that had been maintained far beyond its reasonable lifespan, the careful way she held herself that suggested someone accustomed to managing pain without complaint. Emma's crying had subsided to hiccups and sniffles, but she remained pressed against her mother's side with the clinging behavior of a child who'd learned not to take adult presence for granted. Her wide brown eyes tracked between Marcus and the damaged car with the kind of hypervigilance that developed in children who'd experienced enough instability to understand that adults' moods and circumstances could change rapidly with serious consequences for their security and safety. "Let's worry about repairs later," Marcus said, surprising himself with the gentle tone he hadn't used in years of business negotiations and social interactions. "Right now, you need medical attention, and your daughter needs to be checked by a doctor to make sure she wasn't injured in the accident." Sophia's protective instincts flared at the suggestion of medical intervention she couldn't afford. "We're fine, really. I'm a nurse, I know how to assess for injuries. We just need to call a tow truck and figure out transportation to get Emma to daycare and me to work." The mention of her profession explained the competent way she'd handled the aftermath of the accident, but also revealed the impossible situation she was facing, needing to continue working immediately, despite being involved in a traumatic accident with no reliable transportation and a child who'd been frightened by events beyond her control. Marcus found himself making decisions that violated every principle he'd established for maintaining emotional distance from other people's problems. "My driver can take you wherever you need to go." He offered, the words emerging before his rational mind could intervene with reminders about boundaries and the dangers of getting involved in strangers' complicated lives. "I can't accept that," Sophia replied immediately, her independence asserting itself despite the obvious relief that flickered across her face at the offer of practical help. "You don't know us, and we've already caused enough trouble by damaging your property." The refusal was automatic, but not absolute. Marcus could see the internal struggle between pride and practical necessity playing out in her expression as she calculated options and found them all inadequate for someone who needed to be at work in 2 hours with a 4-year-old who required childcare arrangements that had probably been disrupted by the accident. Emma tugged at her mother's scrubs with the persistence of a child who'd learned that adult conversations often determined her immediate future in ways she couldn't influence, but definitely needed to monitor. "Mommy, is our car broken forever?" she asked with the directness that children used when they needed information about how much their world was about to change. The question carried weight that went far beyond transportation logistics. Sophia's car represented her independence, her ability to work multiple jobs, her capacity to handle emergencies, and maintain the mobility that single parenthood required. Its destruction wasn't just an inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe that could trigger a cascade of consequences affecting everything from employment to housing stability. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart," Sophia replied with the kind of calm reassurance that parents provided when they had no idea how they'd actually solve the problems they were promising to handle. "Everything's going to be okay." Marcus recognized the tone, the same false confidence he'd used with himself during the worst period of his life, when everything had been falling apart. But admitting vulnerability felt more dangerous than pretending strength he didn't possess. The memory of his own desperate years created an unexpected bridge of understanding between their vastly different circumstances. "Please," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that surprised both of them. "Let me help. It's the least I can do after you've been hurt on my property." The offer wasn't technically accurate. The accident had occurred on the public street outside his gates, but Marcus found himself wanting to create justification for involvement that his rational mind was arguing against. Something about Sophia's combination of strength and vulnerability was awakening protective instincts he'd buried so deeply he'd forgotten they existed. Sophia's resolve wavered as she looked at Emma's tear-stained face and felt the throbbing in her ribs that suggested injuries more serious than she'd initially assessed. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her daughter's well-being depended on making practical decisions rather than maintaining independence that might be admirable but wasn't sustainable in crisis situations. "Just to the hospital," she finally agreed, her voice carrying the reluctance of someone who'd learned that accepting help often came with expectations and obligations that could be more costly than the original problem. "Emma should be checked by a pediatrician, and I probably need an X-ray to make sure nothing's broken." Marcus felt a surge of relief that surprised him with its intensity. He hadn't realized how much he'd wanted her to accept his offer, how much the possibility of her walking away had felt like another loss in a life that had already contained too many. "I'll call my driver," he said, already moving toward the phone with efficiency that came from years of making decisions quickly and implementing them immediately. As they waited for the car to arrive, an awkward silence settled over the group. Two adults who didn't know each other, but had been thrust into intimacy by circumstances, and a child who was processing trauma while trying to understand the adult dynamics that would determine her immediate future. Emma had stopped crying but remained pressed against her mother's side, watching Marcus with the careful attention children paid to new adults who might become important in their lives. "What's your name?" Emma asked suddenly, her 4-year-old directness cutting through adult politeness and complicated social navigation with the kind of honest curiosity that made genuine connection possible. "Marcus," he replied, crouching down to her eye level with movements that revealed his unfamiliarity with children, but genuine desire to communicate respectfully with someone whose opinion mattered to him in ways he didn't understand. "What's yours?" "Emma," she replied solemnly, then added with the kind of personal information that children shared freely. "My mommy takes care of sick people at the hospital, and she's really good at making boo-boos better." The simple introduction created a moment of human connection that transcended the awkwardness of their situation, while providing Marcus with insight into the kind of person Sophia was, someone whose child felt proud of her work and secure in her competence despite the obvious challenges they faced together. "Your mommy sounds very special," Marcus said, his voice carrying sincerity that made Sophia look at him with surprise. Most people offered polite acknowledgement of her profession without understanding the skill, dedication, and emotional strength required to provide healthcare for critically ill patients while maintaining stability for a young child who needed consistency and security that her work schedule made difficult to provide. The arrival of Marcus's driver prevented further conversation, but as they settled into the luxury sedan that was probably worth more than Sophia's annual income, she found herself wondering about the man who'd emerged from his fortress to help strangers whose problems he could have easily delegated to staff members paid to handle such inconveniences. Marcus rode with them to the hospital, telling himself he needed to ensure they received proper medical attention, while avoiding examination of the real reasons he didn't want to let them disappear from his life as quickly as they'd entered it. The woman beside him represented everything he'd learned to avoid complications, emotional risk, and the possibility of caring about someone whose well-being he couldn't control through wealth or influence. But as Emma fell asleep against her mother's shoulder during the ride, her small hand still clutching Sophia's scrubs with the trust that came from knowing her mother would protect her, regardless of circumstances, Marcus felt something shift inside him that had been frozen for 10 years of careful isolation and emotional self-protection. The hospital visit revealed a concussion for Sophia and bruised ribs that would require careful monitoring, while Emma's examination showed no serious injuries beyond emotional trauma that would heal with time and continued security from her mother's presence. The medical bills would have been financially devastating for someone in Sophia's circumstances, but Marcus's discreet conversation with the billing department ensured that insurance would cover everything without creating additional stress for a family that had already endured enough crisis for one day. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Sophia faced the reality of their situation: no car, no immediate transportation options, and a daughter who needed stability while she figured out how to rebuild their mobility and maintain employment that depended on reliable access to work locations. The careful balance she'd maintained for years had been shattered by 30 seconds of mechanical failure, leaving her to reconstruct their lives from pieces that no longer fit together in ways that made survival possible. "Let me drive you home," Marcus offered, his tone carrying none of the casual dismissal that wealthy people often used when providing token assistance to make themselves feel better about inequality they had no intention of actually addressing. "And we should talk about replacing your car so you can get back to work and normal routines as quickly as possible." The offer was both generous and terrifying. Acceptance would create obligation and dependency that could be more dangerous than the original crisis, while refusal would leave her with problems she had no resources to solve independently. Sophia's experience with wealthy men had taught her that their help always came with expectations and conditions that could be more costly than the original problems they offered to solve. But Emma's sleepy voice from beside her made the decision inevitable. "Mommy, I like Marcus. He has kind eyes like yours." The 4-year-old's assessment carried weight that adult skepticism couldn't override. Children possessed instincts about trustworthiness that hadn't been complicated by experience with manipulation and disappointment. If Emma felt safe with Marcus, perhaps the risk of accepting his help was worth taking for her daughter's sake, if not her own. "Just until I can make other arrangements." Sophia agreed, her voice carrying the careful boundaries of someone who understood that survival sometimes required accepting help, while maintaining the independence necessary to avoid becoming trapped by others' generosity and the obligations that inevitably accompanied it. Marcus felt another surge of relief mixed with anxiety about what he was committing himself to by getting involved in their lives. 10 years of emotional isolation had been safe, but empty, protecting him from hurt, while also preventing the joy and meaning that came from genuine connection with people who mattered enough to risk vulnerability and potential loss. But as Emma smiled at him sleepily, and Sophia's tense posture relaxed slightly, in acceptance of assistance she couldn't provide for herself, Marcus realized that some risks were worth taking if they led to the possibility of finally emerging from the prison of safety he'd constructed around his heart. The ride to Sophia's apartment revealed the extent of the economic divide between their worlds. Her building was clean but worn, located in a neighborhood where families like hers made do with limited resources, while working multiple jobs to maintain stability that was always one crisis away from complete collapse. Marcus's car looked out of place among the older vehicles and practical transportation that filled the parking lot, a visible reminder of the different realities they inhabited. Sophia's apartment was small but immaculate, decorated with Emma's artwork, and filled with books that revealed her intellectual curiosity and commitment to ongoing education, despite the time constraints that made learning a luxury rather than a given. The space felt warm and lived in, reflecting the kind of authentic family life that money couldn't purchase, but love and dedication could create even in the most challenging circumstances. Emma immediately ran to her room to show Marcus her favorite stuffed animals and picture books, her earlier trauma forgotten in the security of familiar surroundings and her mother's continued presence. Her chatter filled the apartment with the kind of joyful noise that Marcus's mansion had been missing for years of careful quiet and controlled solitude. "She's remarkable," Marcus commented as Emma organized an impromptu puppet show using stuffed animals and boundless imagination that transformed their small living room into a theater of endless possibilities. "You're doing an incredible job raising her despite everything you're managing alone." The compliment was genuine, but also revealed Marcus's growing understanding of the challenges Sophia faced as a single mother, balancing demanding work with complete responsibility for a child who needed attention, stability, and opportunities that her financial limitations made difficult to provide consistently. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me," Sophia replied, her voice carrying the fierce love that had motivated every decision she'd made since Emma's birth 4 years earlier. "Everything I do is for her. The work, the school, the sacrifices. She deserves every opportunity I can create for her." The simple statement revealed the depth of Sophia's commitment and the source of her strength during years of struggle that would have defeated someone with less motivation or resilience. Marcus recognized something familiar in her dedication, the same fierce protectiveness he'd felt for the people he'd loved before learning that caring deeply meant risking devastation when loss inevitably occurred. As evening approached, the practical questions about transportation and work schedules became unavoidable. Sophia needed to be at the hospital for her night shift in 12 hours. Emma required childcare arrangements that had been disrupted by the accident, and the destroyed car represented ongoing transportation challenges that would affect every aspect of their daily routines. "I have a proposal," Marcus said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone making an offer he hoped wouldn't be rejected, but understood might be too much for someone to accept. "Let me provide a car for you to use while we figure out a permanent solution. And if you need help with childcare or anything else while you're recovering from your injuries, I have resources that could make things easier for both of you." The offer was generous beyond anything Sophia could have expected, but also raised questions about motivation and expectations that made acceptance feel dangerous, despite its obvious practical benefits. Wealthy men didn't typically provide extensive assistance to single mothers without expecting something in return, and Sophia's experiences had taught her to be suspicious of gifts that seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do all of this for strangers?" she asked her question, carrying curiosity mixed with caution about motivations that might not be as altruistic as they appeared on the surface. Marcus's answer surprised him with its honesty. "Because I've been alone for 10 years, and meeting you and Emma today reminded me what I've been missing. Not just companionship, but purpose beyond my own comfort and security. Maybe helping you is really helping myself remember what it feels like to care about something meaningful." The admission was more vulnerable than anything Marcus had shared with another person in years of careful emotional isolation. It revealed both his loneliness and his hope that connection might be possible without the devastation he'd experienced when previous relationships had ended in betrayal and loss that had taught him to choose safety over intimacy. Sophia studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas that her experience had taught her to expect when offers seemed too generous to be genuine. Instead, she saw vulnerability that matched her own carefully hidden fears about trusting people who had the power to help or hurt her depending on their character and motivations. Emma's sleepy request from the couch made the decision for both of them. "Mommy, can Marcus come read me a story before bed? He has a nice voice, and I think he's lonely like we used to be." The 4-year-old's observation cut through adult complications with the kind of direct insight that children possessed when they hadn't yet learned to doubt their instincts about people's fundamental character and intentions. If Emma sensed that Marcus was genuinely lonely rather than manipulative, perhaps Sophia's protective instincts could allow for the possibility that his offer was genuine rather than calculated. One story. Sophia agreed her acceptance, carrying both hope and caution about letting someone new into their carefully protected family dynamic. But then it's bedtime, and Marcus probably needs to get home too. As Marcus settled beside Emma on the couch with a picture book about brave little animals going on adventures, Sophia watched from the kitchen doorway and tried to remember the last time she'd seen her daughter so immediately comfortable with a new adult. Emma's trust wasn't given lightly. She'd learned early to be cautious around strangers whose intentions might not align with her and her mother's best interests. But something about Marcus's gentle patience as Emma corrected his pronunciation of character names and insisted on explaining plot details he'd missed, suggested someone who was genuinely enjoying the interaction, rather than performing kindness for adult approval or personal benefit. His laughter at Emma's commentary was spontaneous and warm, revealing glimpses of the person he'd been before 10 years of isolation had taught him to guard his heart against potential pain. As Emma finally fell asleep during the 3rd story, she'd requested Marcus found himself reluctant to leave the warmth and authenticity of their small apartment for the empty mansion that awaited his return. The evening had reminded him of everything he'd given up in pursuit of emotional safety. Spontaneous laughter, genuine connection, and the kind of simple joy that came from caring about other people's happiness and well-being. "Thank you," Sophia said, as Marcus prepared to leave, her voice carrying gratitude mixed with uncertainty about what accepting his help might mean for their future interactions, and the obligations that might come with continued assistance from someone whose resources could solve their immediate problems while potentially creating new complications. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his response carrying sincerity that surprised both of them. "Tonight reminded me what I've been missing by choosing safety over connection. Maybe we can help each other figure out how to trust again." The admission hung in the air between them as Marcus left for his empty mansion, and Sophia prepared for another night of caring for other people's emergencies while managing her own family's needs. Both understood that the accident had created possibilities neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed the chance to discover that love might be worth the risk of potential loss, and that family could be created through choice and commitment rather than just biological connection. The millionaire who'd spent 10 years alone was about to learn that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased, but had to be earned through vulnerability, patience, and the courage to open his heart to people who might teach him that some things were worth risking everything to protect and cherish. The single mother who'd been managing crisis after crisis was about to discover that accepting help didn't always mean losing independence, and that some offers of assistance came from genuine desire to serve, rather than control the people whose lives could be transformed through partnership rather than charity. As Emma slept peacefully in her own bed, and Sophia prepared for another night shift at the hospital, neither could have predicted that their lives had just intersected with someone who would challenge everything they thought they knew about trust family, and the possibility that some crashes were actually the beginning of journeys toward destinations they'd never dared to imagine were possible. The accident that had seemed like a disaster was about to become the catalyst for healing that none of them had known they needed, proving that sometimes the most important meetings happened when people collided accidentally with exactly the person they'd been searching for without knowing they'd been looking for completion all along.